Mysterious disappearances have captivated the public's attention for decades. In fact, on this channel, we have discussed many cases of disappearances that remain unsolved. But there are other stories where the truth is as outrageous as it is enigmatic. Cases of people who mobilized entire families, police forces, and dozens of investigators only for it to be discovered that they were never truly lost, as the truth is that they escaped of their own free will. So, get comfortable and turn off the lights, because these are 7 mysterious disappearances that turned out to be hoaxes. How are you? Good morning, afternoon, or evening. And here we begin. John Darwin. In 2002, John Darwin was 51 years old. He worked as a prison officer at HM Prison Home House, and, whenever he could, he would escape to the sea with his red kayak, a hobby he had cultivated for years and which, according to his acquaintances, he handled with calm and meticulousness. On the morning of March 21, he left for the beach at Seaton Carew, greeted a neighbor, pushed his boat out, and disappeared into the horizon of the North Sea, a sea that was unusually calm that day. By late afternoon, Anne, his wife, alerted the authorities because John had not returned and no one at work knew anything about him. What followed was an intense search involving coast guards, boats, and helicopters, scanning more than 160 square kilometers of coastline until an oar appeared, then the kayak with minor damage and nothing else. No life jacket drifting, no credible sign of a shipwreck. Rescuers, puzzled by the good weather, had no clear explanation. Yet, as the days passed, the only possible narrative was that of a silent and definitive accident. This was a devastating blow to John's wife and sons, however. Life went on, and in 2003, John was legally declared dead by a judge, allowing Anne to collect insurance policies and pensions totaling around £250,000, pay off a mortgage that was suffocating them, and slowly rebuild what remained of a family broken by the absence. In the neighborhood, they saw her as an upright widow who, with her 2 adult sons coming and going, maintained a routine while trying not to fall apart. The years passed until the 1st of December 2007, when the story took a turn that seemed taken from a movie. A thin, gray-haired man with vacant eyes walked into the West End Central Police Station in London, approached the counter, and said, "I think I am a missing person." He further claimed that he did not remember anything from the last few years, that his name might be John, and that he needed help. The police confirmed his identity, notified the family, and the entire country witnessed the reunion of 2 sons who suddenly had their father back, and a wife who was suddenly no longer a widow. At first, the news spread like a miracle. However, little by little, the cracks in the account became evident. John's amnesia was convenient, and the story told in that way had gaps that were too clean. But everything exploded a few days later when a British media outlet received a tip with a photograph. In it, one could see John and Anne together, smiling, posing with real estate agents in a tropical setting. The image, uploaded to the website of a Panamanian real estate agency, proved that when he was still listed as deceased, John had been shopping in Central America. Different sources place this photo as being taken in 2005 or 2006, as the exact chronology varies by report, but the result was the same. The resurrection no longer smelled like a miracle. It smelled like fraud. From there, the story collapsed quickly. The police, who had already opened a financial investigation into Anne's movements and property transfers, interrogated the couple, and with all the evidence in hand, a confession emerged. John had never had an accident. That March day, he paddled to an agreed point. He let the sea do the rest with the kayak and the oar. He went ashore in another area where Anne picked him up by car. For years, he lived hidden just a few meters from his old front door in a bedsit attached to the family home, with an improvised passage between the 2 dwellings. The confinement, as it almost always does, began to be unbearable, so John grew tired of the invisibility and, with a fake beard, a cap, and a feigned limp, went out into the street without anyone recognizing him. After this, he took another step. He stole the identity of a deceased baby, John Jones, to get a passport, travel discreetly, and scout properties in Gibraltar, Spain, and especially in Panama, where he and Anne created a company and moved money from sales and loans to buy an apartment and then a farm near the canal, with the idea of a small canoe business in the tropics. However, to regularize their status, they needed an investor visa, which, since 2007 required police verification from the UK, So they had the idea of making John return with amnesia as a shield, trusting in the public commotion to buy time. But they hadn't counted on that photograph becoming public, and thus the entire plan finally fell apart. Their children, who had symbolically buried their father, appeared before cameras and courts with a mixture of fury and disappointment. They knew nothing. Nobody had explained anything to them. They had simply been used as part of the deception. The press dubbed John the Canoe Man, and the public opinion, which had once felt moved by the story, was aggressive and indignant. In July 2008, the sentence arrived. 6 years and 3 months for him, 6.5 years for Anne. The state recovered practically everything collected from insurance policies and pensions through seizures and sales, and both were released on parole in 2011. After this, the marriage dissolved. Anne, through therapy and distance, tried to mend the bond with her children, while John, without too many words, left for the Philippines, remarried, and resumed his passion for kayaking in warmer waters. This story, which began as an apparent maritime mystery, ended up becoming one of the most remembered fraud cases in the United Kingdom. And although John and Anne paid their legal debts, the mark they left on their family and the collective memory of citizens seems simply impossible to erase. Natasha Ryan. On the 31st of August 1998, the coastal city of Rockhampton in Queensland, Australia, woke up to disturbing news. Natasha Ryan, a 14-year-old student, had not arrived at school. She had left home that morning like any other, in her uniform and with her backpack, but she never crossed the school gates. At first, the family and authorities thought it was a momentary absence, perhaps a misunderstanding or a teenage prank. But soon the unease turned into alarm. The police organized searches with dozens of volunteers, tracker dogs, and helicopters flying over the area. The streets, the storefronts, and the front pages of newspapers were filled with her image. Her mother, Jenny, even appeared on television pleading through tears that if anyone had her daughter captive, please let her return home. A few days later, the investigations took an even more worrying turn. Natasha's disappearance coincided with the pattern of Leonard Fraser, a serial killer who was already under suspicion for the kidnapping and murder of several women in the region. Authorities began to fear that Natasha was a new victim, and the entire neighborhood shared that silent fear left by the idea of a predator on the loose. Weeks passed. Then months, and there was not a single solid clue. There were no witnesses, no signs, and no body. The case went cold, and over time, the disappearance was filed away as one of those mysteries that had no answer, while Natasha, in the collective memory, became part of the most tragic statistic. However, 5 years later, in April 2003, Natasha's name was heard again, but in a context absolutely no one expected. During the trial against Fraser, in which Natasha's disappearance was part of the accusation, the police received an anonymous tip that led them to the house of Scott Black, a 26-year-old man who had been Natasha's boyfriend before her disappearance. When the agents entered the dwelling and opened a closet, they found her there. Natasha was alive, breathing heavily, but in good physical condition. She had been hiding just a few kilometers from her home for almost 5 years, while all of Australia thought she was dead. The news interrupted Fraser's trial. In the courtroom, her mother received the news and ran out, unable to believe it. Upon arriving at the house and seeing her standing there, she hugged her with a mixture of relief, confusion, and rage. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked through tears. But Natasha barely muttered that she was sorry, unable to provide a clear explanation in those moments. With the bewilderment, the explanations also arrived, and what was revealed divided public opinion. In the following days, it became known that Natasha had decided to run away to live with Scott, and that he had kept her hidden, fearing he would be arrested. According to her testimony, she rarely went out. She spent the hours reading magazines, watching television, and practicing yoga in the closet to keep in shape. The strangest thing was that she had seen reports on the news about her supposed murder and the trial of the man accused of killing her, without that leading her to contact her family. When the story came to light, all of Australia reacted. Some considered her a selfish young woman who had allowed her mother to live through years of unnecessary pain, while others saw her as a vulnerable teenager trapped in a controlling relationship that isolated her from the outside world. Debate programs discussed whether it was a case of youthful rebellion or emotional manipulation. Scott Black was convicted of perjury and interfering with police work. Natasha, although she did not face charges, had to endure months of media attention and public criticism. Her case became the subject of documentaries and reports, analyzed as an example of how complex human behavior can become under pressure and isolation. Over the years, Natasha rebuilt her life, married, had children, and avoided contact with the press, living far from the media spotlight that once made her the face of a national scandal. For a long time, it seemed that her story had been left in the past as a rarity within the police chronicle. However, in 2024, her name appeared in the headlines again. At 40, Natasha Ryan was found dead in her home in Rockhampton. Authorities did not disclose the cause, and thus, abruptly, a chapter that had been marked by mystery, controversy, and decisions that affected an entire community was closed. Erica Ruff. On the 24th of December 2010, the tranquility of Longview, Texas, was broken by a disturbing find. Inside an automobile parked in front of her in-laws' house lay the lifeless body of Erica Ruff. The scene left no room for doubt. A self-inflicted gunshot wound put an end to her story, or at least to the story everyone thought they knew. In life, Lori had been reserved, distant, and difficult to decipher. She avoided talking about her childhood, claimed to have no living relatives, and cut off any conversation that came too close to her past. Not even Blake Ruff, her husband since 2003, had managed to break through that wall of silence. To the eyes of Blake's family, she was an enigma, and the relationship was always marked by that feeling that she was hiding something more than simple, painful memories. Lori had studied business and built a stable life in Texas. She seemed determined and hardworking, but her hermetic nature was noticeable in every family gathering. In 2008, with the birth of her daughter, that reserved character gave way to erratic behavior. She became possessive, isolated the child from everyone, and fueled a growing paranoia that ended up wearing down the marriage until it led to divorce. And so, on Christmas Eve 2010, Lori drove to her in-laws' house. There, locked in her car, she took her own life. She left a note for her husband and daughter, but in it, there were no confessions or clues about who she really was. However, among her belongings, there was something much more revealing. A small metal chest that, once opened, began to undo the identity that Lori had maintained for more than 2 decades. Inside were documents that did not fit with her official history. The most striking was a birth certificate in the name of Becky Sue Turner, a girl who had died in a fire in 1971 at just 2 years old. That document, obtained in 1988, allowed her to obtain other identifications and, finally, change her legal name to Erica Ruff. The investigation began to reconstruct a different account. Her real name was Kimberly McLean, born in 1,968 Inches, Pennsylvania. At 18, after a tense relationship with her mother and stepfather, she decided to cut all contact. She told her mother she didn't want to be found and disappeared without a trace. In 1988, Kimberly moved to California, illegally obtained the certificate of Little Becky, and began using her identity. From there, she wove a new life, erasing any link to her past. No one in Pennsylvania ever heard from her again. Throughout the years, neither her husband nor her friends in Texas suspected to what extent her story was invented. Only after her death, and with the help of genealogists and DNA tests, was it confirmed in 2016 that the mysterious Erica Ruff and the missing Kimberly McLean were the same person. But even with the truth about her origin, the questions remained open. What motivated an 18-year-old girl to wipe herself off the map with such determination? Was it a flight from fear, an act of rebellion, or a reaction to something that no one else knew? The case of Erica Ruff or Kimberly McLean continues to leave the sensation of an incomplete puzzle. A life lived under a borrowed name, an identity reconstructed piece by piece, a truth buried for decades, and an enigma that, even partially resolved, continues to leave the disturbing feeling that not even death managed to offer all the answers. If you are enjoying this content, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe. You can also help us a lot by leaving a comment or recommending our channel to your friends. If you are on Spotify, don't forget to rate us with 5 stars. Joseph Newton Chandler III. The summer of 2002 did not bode anything out of the ordinary in Eastlake, Ohio, a quiet suburb east of Cleveland. But the daily routine was broken on the morning of July 30, when the smell of decomposition emerged from a small apartment. After several days of anonymous calls and the insistence of worried neighbors, a janitor finally decided to enter, and what he found there was deeply disturbing. The lifeless body of a man in a fetal position with a firearm on the floor, a face unrecognizable due to the stage of decomposition and the air so corrupted that the detectives who arrived at the scene had to use gas masks. The autopsy revealed the cause of death, a self-inflicted shot to the mouth. The air conditioning was off, the windows sealed, and the calendar that was hanging on a wall had a day marked the day of his death, as if this had all been planned in advance. It was the meticulous suicide of someone who did not expect to be found in time. The man was identified by his driver's license as Joseph Newton Chandler III. This seemed like a clear fact until investigators discovered that the real Chandler had died a long time ago, in 1945, at just 8 years old in a car accident in Texas. Someone had stolen that identity decades ago, and that someone had been the man found in Eastlake. As they reviewed his recent life, the image that emerged was that of a ghost. Chandler lived alone, did not receive visitors, and his interactions with others were minimal. He worked as a technical draftsman and later as an electrical engineer at Lubrizol. But even there, he went unnoticed. He did not share personal anecdotes, did not mention his family, did not talk about his childhood, and barely engaged in conversations. Some colleagues remembered that he talked from time to time about electronic devices he built at home or about solitary car trips, like that time he drove more than 1,000 kilometers alone to visit a store and turned back when he couldn't find parking at his apartment. The investigators found no family photos, letters, or objects that indicated ties to another life. They did find self-help magazines, electronics manuals, scattered notes, and a computer that he himself had destroyed before dying, as if he wanted to erase any digital trace. Everything reinforced the idea of a man who had spent decades taking care of every detail to remain in the shadows. For years, the case remained stalled. Authorities knew he was not Joseph Newton Chandler III, but they had no idea who he really was, at least until 2014, when a group of detectives decided to try a new path: forensic genealogy. They recovered a DNA sample from the body and sent it to specialized laboratories that began comparing it with public and private genealogical databases. The process was very slow. It was a matter of building a family tree branch by branch from quite distant genetic coincidences, discarding and confirming potential relatives until being able to find a core family. And finally, 4 years later, in 2018, the puzzle was completed. The man who had called himself Chandler was, in reality, Robert Ivan Nichols, born in 1,926 inches, New York City. Nichols had served in the Navy during World War II and was wounded in combat, for which he received the Purple Heart. After the war, he married and had children, but in 1965, without warning, he abandoned his family. He left a note for his wife saying he didn't want them to look for him, and from that moment on, he disappeared off the map, reinventing himself under the identity of a child who had passed away. The revelation closed a chapter of searching but opened another of questions. No one knows for sure why Nichols chose to disappear. Some suggest he may have committed a crime and was fleeing from justice. Others think it was an emotional flight, a total rejection of his previous life. There were even more sinister theories that linked him to unsolved crimes, and even claimed he could have had ties to the Zodiac Killer, although there is really no solid evidence to support these hypotheses. The only certain thing is that Nichols lived more than 3 decades as Chandler in complete social isolation. His life seemed designed not to leave tracks. There were no close friendships, no photographs, and no documents that were not simply part of this stolen identity. The only personal trace he left was an enigmatic phrase he once said to one of his coworkers: "I have something important to tell you, and I will do it someday." But that day never came. The final scene of his life, with the windows sealed, the air conditioning off, and the calendar marked until the last day, reflects the same control he exerted over his existence, deciding how and when to end it without giving explanations. And although forensic genealogy managed to put a real name on his headstone, his story remains marked by an impenetrable silence. At heart, Robert Ivan Nichols was 2 people and, at the same time, none. A decorated veteran who left everything behind and a man without a past who lived under a borrowed name. His death closed a circle that he himself had opened years ago, in 1965, but left intact the enigma of why someone chose to erase himself from the world like that and how, for so long, he managed that no one could find him. Lawrence Joseph Bader. In March 1957, the life of Lawrence Joseph Bader, a sporting goods salesman in Akron, Ohio, seemed to be heading toward a breaking point. He had debts he couldn't settle. His marriage was on the verge of collapse, and the economic pressure kept him restless. However, for those who knew him, Lawrence remained a correct, hard-working man, with no evident signs that something drastic was about to occur. On the afternoon of March 15, he decided to go fishing on Lake Erie. The weather was not ideal. There were storm warnings, but Bader ignored them and rented a small boat. He did not return. Hours later, the boat was found adrift with damage, but no trace of its occupant. The Coast Guard combed the area for days, but found nothing. The conclusion was that he had fallen into the water and drowned. His wife and 3 children had to face the grief and also the weight of financial uncertainty. As months passed, the case was filed as just another accident in the waters of Lake Erie, and the name of Lawrence Bader remained etched in the memory of his family as an absence without a body to bury. 5 years later, more than 1,000 kilometers away in Omaha, Nebraska, a man appeared who seemed to have nothing in common with the salesman from Ohio. He called himself John Fritz Johnson. He dressed strikingly, was charismatic, participated in archery events, and worked as a host at a local television station. He seemed to enjoy a life completely different from the one Lawrence had led. In February 1965, during an archery tournament in Chicago, the story took a turn. Among the audience was a relative of Lawrence Bader, who upon seeing him was paralyzed by the resemblance. The family insisted, and although Fritz denied it firmly, he agreed to have his fingerprints taken. The result left no doubts. John Fritz Johnson and Lawrence Joseph Bader were the same person, a national scandal. Bader, now with a mustache and an eccentric lifestyle, claimed he didn't remember anything about his previous life. According to his version, after the supposed accident in 1957, he had woken up on a beach without knowing who he was. He adopted a new name and started from scratch. Doctors who examined him spoke of amnesia, but in public opinion, the suspicion grew that he had faked his disappearance to escape his debts and his marriage. The revelation placed him in an uncomfortable legal situation. He was still married to his wife from Ohio, but had also contracted marriage in Nebraska. Furthermore, any economic benefit his first wife might have received as a widow was at risk of being annulled. The reunion with his family was not simple. His children didn't quite remember him, and he didn't seem interested in resuming that life. In fact, he even said that if he could choose, he would prefer to remain Fritz and not be Lawrence again. His new wife in Nebraska was also trapped in the media storm upon discovering that the man she had married not only had another identity but another family. The press devoured every detail, and every statement from Bader seemed to fuel the morbid curiosity. The mystery ended abruptly a year later. In 1966, he was diagnosed with advanced and inoperable cancer. He died that same year without it ever being proven if his amnesia was real or if it had been an elaborate escape. The truth went with him, leaving a story that is still mentioned today as one of the strangest cases of double identity in the United States. A man who died in a lake, reborn hundreds of kilometers away, and lived a completely different life until destiny caught up with him again. Patrick McDermott. In June 2005, Patrick Kim McDermott, a cameraman of Korean origin who had worked on television programs and independent productions, seemed to be at a complicated moment in his life. He was 48 years old, lived in Los Angeles, and for almost a decade, he had maintained an intermittent romantic relationship with renowned actress and singer Olivia Newton-John, an icon of music and cinema thanks to her role in Grease. Although their romance had its ups and downs, for many, it was evident that there was a strong bond between them. On the 30th of June 2005, McDermott boarded a boat named Freedom to participate in a night fishing excursion that departed from the port of San Pedro in California. The two-hour trip gathered 22 passengers and crew who would quietly traverse the coast. The activity was routine, with nothing to make one suspect that anything would go out of the ordinary. However, upon returning to port the following day, Patrick was no longer on board. The most disturbing thing was that none of those present remembered seeing him fall into the water, have an accident, or be the victim of any altercation. There were no witnesses, no screams, and no splashes that alerted the crew. His belongings, including his wallet, keys, and documents, were found in his bunk as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Given this, the authorities of the Coast Guard and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department initiated an intense aerial and maritime search that lasted for days without positive results. As weeks passed, the official investigation began to focus on the possibility that McDermott had decided to disappear voluntarily. There were indications pointing in this direction, as in the previous months, Patrick had accumulated significant debts, had stopped paying child support for his teenage son, and had received legal notifications for these same breaches. Some friends stated that they had noticed him worried and evasive, but despite these suspicions, the case officially remained open for years. In 2008, after finding no physical trace nor obtaining new leads, Patrick McDermott was legally declared dead, leaving Olivia Newton-John completely devastated. The singer dedicated time to processing her loss, stating publicly that she needed to accept the situation to be able to move on. But this story, as you can imagine, took an unexpected turn. Between 2009 and 2016, various private investigators and television programs began receiving reports of sightings of a man who fit McDermott's description in coastal areas of Mexico, particularly in Puerto Vallarta and Sayulita in Nayarit. In 2017, the Australian magazine New Idea published photographs taken by a team of investigators who claimed to have located McDermott in Sayulita, accompanied by a woman of German nationality. In the images, the man looked relaxed, sunbathing and chatting on the beach. According to these investigators, McDermott had faked his death in 2005 to be able to free himself from his financial problems and start a new life abroad. The testimony suggested that he worked in tourism activities and lived discreetly, avoiding any media exposure. Although the authenticity of the photos was never 100% confirmed, nor was a public statement from Patrick himself obtained. For many, the evidence was convincing. For Olivia Newton-John, the news was very painful. Not only had she faced the grief for years, but now she had to assimilate that her partner's disappearance had probably been a premeditated escape. Over time, Olivia decided to move on. She sold the house she had shared with Patrick, and in 2008 she married John Easterling, with whom she lived until her final days. The actress and singer had already fought much tougher battles. In 1992, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, an illness she fought on several occasions throughout her life. On the 8th of August 2022, Olivia Newton-John passed away at 73, leaving behind an indelible legacy in music and cinema and closing, in a definitive way, one of the most enigmatic chapters of her life: the mysterious disappearance and apparent reappearance of Patrick McDermott, the man who perhaps never wanted to be found. Steven Kubaki. In February 1978, Steven Kubaki, a 3-year-old university student at Hope College, Michigan, decided to spend the day cross-country skiing near Lake Michigan. That region, punished every winter by extreme cold, attracted the most enthusiastic skiers, but it also held a disturbing reputation. The weather could change without warning, and there were areas where the wind and snow became a trap for the unwary. Steven, however, was not a novice. He used to go out alone. He enjoyed the calm and silence that white landscape offered. That morning he set off, equipped with his backpack, his poles, and his skis, and headed into the snowy terrain. No one ever saw him return. The next day, when enough time had passed to set off the alarms, local authorities and dozens of volunteers started the search. What they found soon left more questions than answers. His skis and poles lay on the snow next to his backpack in perfect order. The tracks in the snow extended in a straight line and stopped abruptly, as if whoever left them had disappeared into thin air. There were no signs of a struggle or indications that he had broken the ice to fall into the water. The most logical hypothesis at that moment was that Steven had entered the frozen lake and had fallen, but the teams did not find any hole in the ice. It was searched on foot, by snowmobile, and from the air, but there was no trace of him. The case went cold and was filed as just another disappearance, without a solid clue to follow. 15 months later, the story took a disconcerting turn. Steven suddenly appeared in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, about 40 miles from where he was last seen. He arrived walking at his father's house, thinner but healthy, without serious injuries or signs of having suffered a severe accident. The most disturbing thing was not his state, but what he said or what he could not say. He claimed not to remember anything that happened during the year and 3 months he was away. According to him, the last thing he remembered was skiing, and the next thing was waking up in an open field without knowing where he was. He was wearing clothes he didn't recognize and carrying a backpack that wasn't his, with maps and objects from places he had never been. He said that upon opening his eyes, he felt as if he had been running for a long time, exhausted and disoriented, and that he simply started walking until he found something familiar. Beyond that, he gave no explanations. Some believe he didn't remember anything, others that he didn't want to talk. In any case, he distanced himself from the media and avoided addressing the topic in public. Years later, investigators and mystery buffs began to link his case to what they call the Michigan Triangle, an area around the lake associated with inexplicable disappearances, strange accidents, and even supposed UFO sightings. There is no solid proof that links Steven to something supernatural, but the nature of his disappearance fuels all kinds of theories. More than 4 decades later, no one knows what happened during those 15 months. To this day, the mystery persists, as cold and silent as the lake that saw him disappear that winter morning. Thank you for subscribing, leaving your like, and following us on social media. We hope you have enjoyed these mysteries. Without further ado, I say goodbye. See you later.